Finally, to the last installment on the series here. Lots to talk about, so I'm going to kind of move in here and get going. We've been talking about the gospel and the psyche. One story and two idiots. One theological, one psychological. Three dimensions. We talked about the psyche, myth, and nature. That's our mantra. That the psyche story is somehow the same story as myth and religion story. It takes some digging to find it. That's sort of been my quest over the years. And ultimately it's nature's story. That is, it's a story that arises from within. It arises from nature itself. Not imposed upon it necessarily, but evoked from it. And then the four elements that we talked about, the four movements in the story, going from Jesus the visionary to Jesus the sage, and then finally into what I'm calling the shadow elements, the feeling function as it appears in this story. We'll talk a little more about that this morning. And then finally to the cross itself as the culminating movement of the story. So last time we tried to summarize this movement across the meridian, and what I meant by that is the midpoint of the story is the Transfiguration, approximately chapter 9 of the Gospel, where Jesus somehow, the whole narrative crosses a point of no return. Jesus begins to call himself the Son of Man. He predicts his own arrest and death for the first time. These things start to come up in the story. By the way, this is immediately after they had gone up to the mountain and he was transfigured and he became glittering white as no fuller on earth could have made his clothes. Matthew is more explicit in saying that his face shone like the sun. As you will recall, if you've been in the sessions, that I have been equating this story with the solar and the calendar story. Because in the ancient world, there were basically three kinds of myth or spiritual religious story of the gods, if you want to use that term. They had to do with the stars, the sun. That would be the astral myth. They had to do with fertility in the ground, the seasons. That would have to do with food and just surviving. And then fertility itself would be the third one. And so all of those are in some way embedded, at least implicitly, in this story. So he crosses this midpoint, and in the Jungian notion or theory, that would be something you would immediately spark up to and say, what's going on here? Something has happened. He's gone from those dominant functions of intuition and thinking into these inferior functions. Whenever in Jungian theory, whenever we're stressed, whenever our dominant functions, the ones we're so used to, the ones that define us as a person, when they don't work, when they don't get us what we want, or they're not making us comfortable in the world, then stress will push us into these inferior functions, and we'll start to operate in a way that doesn't necessarily play to our strengths, shall we say. And so that's sort of the way I'm looking at this story, and you have to recall and remember that I am basically reading the story through a Jungian lens. I am reading a piece of literature, and I am looking at a literary figure through this notion of the psyche's journey. I don't want anybody to mistakenly think that I'm standing up here saying that the historical Jesus went through this and he was an intuitive and that he had an inferior feeling function. I really can't say that about the historical Jesus. And as a scholar, to be honest with you, there's not much I can say about the historical Jesus. So I'm not talking about that, nor am I talking about the theological Christ of our confession. I'm talking about the figure that Mark seems to depict in his story, and I'm reading that through a Jungian lens. So he predicts his death. He gets fixated on Jerusalem. He's got to go there. He's going from Galilee, descending down, which is literally, a nice image for the psyche or the ego descending into the unconscious, which Jung says it must if it's going to become whole. So then this culminates in the triumphal entry in the temple event in which he overturns the tables. And again, from a Jungian point of view, just a suggestion that seems so out of character. And it seems in a way to be a kind of an activity that is full of this sort of inferior feeling function. It's a little bit extreme. As it says, zeal for my house, for your house has consumed me. It certainly got the attention of the authorities and led to the events that we'll be discussing this morning. So that I'm calling shadow and inferior function. And I want to explore that just a little bit more with you this morning. I have a couple of things to read. Is there a handout today? There is, right? Okay. So here's sort of how it lays out in a larger grid, if you will. We've got the morning of baptism in Galilee, and his ministry in Galilee, the transfiguration. These are the three moments you will recall where there's a breakthrough of the other world, where the boundaries between the two worlds seem to become permeable. The voice from heaven speaks of the transfiguration, it speaks of the baptism. Interestingly, at the crucifixion, the voice that says, "You are the Son of God," doesn't come from God, from the heaven, but comes from a Roman soldier. And it's just dripping with irony, isn't it? That at the moment, that supreme moment, that the people of God didn't recognize it, but the Roman soldier, the pagan, recognized, "You are the Son of God." And as a matter of fact, this whole crucifixion scene we're going to go into is just dripping with irony and contrasts and conflicts of opposites, which again really fits a Jungian model quite well. So here it is laid out in terms of the four functions. You have intuition, thinking as wisdom, that's Jesus the sage, Jesus the visionary. Then he crosses the meridian into this dark prophecy of destruction, and now moving into sacrifice. And so today we're going to talk about the cross a bit. I want to sort of lead into it here. Let me get my trusty notes, which I don't have a place to put, but we'll try that. And, pardon? Oh, I thought somebody said something. Okay. So in this section of feeling, before we go into this, actually it's interesting that in the Jungian notion, there you have a sort of conscious-unconscious divide. And when you move into these inferior functions, he had two words for those. One was shadow. We've kind of talked about shadow a little bit here, and I've done some speaking on it in the past. And also anima. Anima is a big word for, it means soul. It just has to do with an image, a powerful, attractive, or even repelling image with which you become engaged and involved. These are the two ways that the unconscious sort of manifests to the ego as it's moving in. And shadow are just these opposite qualities, and I've already identified those with the feeling function here. And what is interesting is shadow is sort of one level of going into the, if you think of it as descent, shadow is one level of going in, but it brings with it eventually these anima figures, which is an even deeper level of descent into the unconscious. So I asked myself, well, where is the anima in this story? Where is that compelling figure that draws Jesus even deeper into the unconscious? And we had talked about the mother archetype, and we showed the Pieta, remember the Pieta? Jesus returning to the mother. And the mother here, I think, has a lot of different faces and a lot of different roles. She's the nurturing mother that gives birth to the ego hero, but the ego hero, eventually after his or her exploits, must return to the mother. And that's just the way of things. And at this point, it struck me that the temple itself becomes a sort of, not nurturing mother, but that dark side of the archetype. Jung says every archetype has two sides, a light side and a dark side. And the light side of the mother archetype is her nurturing self, the loving self. But the dark side is a kind of devouring self, a kind of smothering self. And this, I think, fits Jesus' relation to the temple at this moment in the story. He seems fixated on it. He must go there. He must straighten things out. And, this almost reads like a Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, the hero is going to do something. There's going to come a moment, and you're going to want to say, stop, don't do that, don't go there, because we all know what's going to happen if you go there. But they go there, and that's the tragedy. And this plays like that. It's like, don't go to the temple. No, they're going to get you. And sure enough, he goes, and sure enough, they get him. And it's very interesting to me. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the book, because I don't think I can paraphrase it as well as I wrote it, hopefully. So, Jesus has been pulled into the orbit of a cosmic drama that threatens to annihilate him. Jung's graphic description of introverted consciousness being dragged into a fateful confrontation with some external object with which it has become obsessed fits the occasion perfectly. As Jung puts it, the force of extroverted feeling pulls the personality into the object. The object assimilates him, whereupon the personal quality of the feeling, which constitutes its charm, disappears. In other words, Jesus is not someone who didn't have feelings or wasn't able to positively express feelings. He had that. But now that feeling function, in a sense, kind of turns dark and pulls him down into what I'm calling sensation. So I'm going to read this one more quote from Jung. It's rather lengthy, but I think it really captures it. Now we're talking about the ego and some object. Just think of Jesus and the temple as I read this and see if it makes sense to you. The more the ego tries to preserve its independence, the more it becomes enslaved to the objective data, the temple, and its whole apparatus. It is now the unconscious that takes care of the relation to the object. And it does so in a way that is calculated to bring the illusion of the ego's power and the fantasy of its superiority to utter ruin. The object assumes terrifying proportions in spite of the conscious attempt to degrade it. In consequence, the ego's efforts to detach itself from the object and to get it under control become all the more violent. Think of the whips and the turning of the tables, the dire prophecies. The introvert's alienation from the object is now complete. He wears himself out with defense measures on the one hand, while on the other hand he makes fruitless attempts to impose his will on the object and to assert himself. It continually imposes itself on him against his will. It arouses in him the most disagreeable and intractable effects and persecutes him at every step. This is me now, going from Jung to Berardi.
Thanks for saying that.
This description could certainly apply to the culminating episode in Jesus' conflicted relation to his intractable rival, the temple. He, not the temple, is the body of the living God. He, not the Jerusalem high priest, is the chosen Son of God. His blood, not the blood of bulls and goats, is the only effective sacrifice for the sins of the people. And his followers are the true priesthood and living stones of the spiritual temple. How tragic, then, is his cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the cry of, if I may say, from the psychological point of view, a grandiose vision coming to utter ruin. If unconscious feeling led him into this religious fatalism, there is no doubt that inferior sensation is leading him into physical confrontation, arrest, and finally crucifixion itself, presenting itself as the will of God. He has become a vessel of divine conflict, the embodiment of the divine human drama. The one who began his career as a visionary healer and son of heaven's king will undergo a brutal corrective from earthly powers, and whose hands sensation is a perverse instrument of unspeakable violence against the mystic body, if not his or her vision. Okay, so we stop there. So this, to me, sets the scene and gives us the sense of what's happening. We're moving now, we're being pulled in from feeling to sensation. The sheer physicality of the drama begins to take over. And the events that unfold in rapid succession have a very physical nature to them. It's no longer teaching and ideas and, all the parables and all the things going on, but it is, this triumphal entry, this symbolic movement into the city. It is the cursing of a fig tree, its leaves withering up. It's turning of the tables. It's a woman with perfume who opens the jar and lets the smell away abroad. It's looking for a man with a jar who's going to meet them and tell them where they're going to have the Passover. It's the Passover meal itself. I mean, I can't think of a more sensate expression of the gospel of redemption and of Christ than the Passover, which becomes the Eucharist. As a matter of fact, we could pause on any one of these and explore them, but there's no time, so I'll take the bread. The bread in the story of the Passover is interesting because there's two functions of the bread, as you recall. And keep in mind, an archetype has a light and dark side. Two functions of the bread, do you recall? The first one is, he says to the disciples, "He who eats bread with me will betray me." So there's the bread of betrayal that he and Judas eat together. And then, of course, there's the bread of the Eucharist, which is his body broken and his blood shed. So it has this dual side to it. Then, of course, there is the arrest itself, in which they are at the garden, and Jesus tells the disciples to be vigilant, to stay awake. But what do? They go to sleep. And you're going to start to see these contrasts and these ironies start to pile up in the story. Awake, asleep. You shouldn't be awake, but you're asleep. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And then, as though to culminate all of this, he has Judas come into the garden and do what? Kiss him. The kiss of betrayal. See the irony in that? That's an amazing and effective, irony. I didn't want that, but that's okay. And so these events are starting to unfold. And if I can find my spot here, I'm going to, let's see, so 142, no, 145. And here's how the events began to unfold, at least in my reading. After the arrest, he's taken in, you know the story. And now I'm just going to summarize some of the elements leading up to and involved in the cross. Here, Israel's Messiah, chosen by God, is forsaken by both Israel and God. My God, why have you forsaken me? How ironic that is. Two antagonists, the Roman procurator and the Jewish chief priest, not the best of friends, work together to crucify him. Jewish priests condemn him as a blasphemer, but a Roman soldier watching him die exclaims him the Son of God. How ironic is that? As the women are coming to his grave to anoint his body for burial, the men have all split. They're gone. The tombstone is rolled away, and in place of a lifeless body sits a white-cladded youth who says, "He is risen." The Sabbath, the last day, the day of rest, the day of quiet, the day of dark, gives way to Sunday, the day of the sun. When he rose early, Mark says, on the first day. By the way, when he was crucified, Mark says, there was darkness at noon. So again, the solar references, if you just go through this and just pull out the solar references, it's very interesting where they line up and how they express the moments. We are now in winter. We are moving into the winter dark. it is dark at noon, he says. But he rose early on the first day of the week. And finally, the one who was crucified outside the gate of Jerusalem sends his disciples back to Galilee. Do you remember that? He says, go back to Galilee, where we started this whole thing. And I love that because it tells me something. It tells me that sensation has done its work. Now, I'm skipping over the time in the tomb, in the grave, so to speak, in that absolute, utter darkness in the mother's cave. And Jung is very clear to say that the terrible mother appears terrible to the ego, but in reality is life itself, bringing the psyche to its fullness. It's really not terrible. It's terrible from a certain point of view because it means ego death. But it also brings the psyche into that cave of renewal. In the absolute darkness where I cannot see, we can't say how it happens. We can't say the mechanism of what it is. We can't even speak what it is. But all we know is that when it's over, there is a morning, a first day, a day of the sun, in which there is a renewal and some incredible transformation. And I would say that Jesus' vision is incredibly transformed in a way that he could not have accomplished in his Galilean sage and vision state. That somehow these additional dimensions had to be brought in, both in their positive and negative aspects. Sensation had to bring a sort of embodied dimension to that vision that was in the beginning sort of, shall I say, disincarnate, a little detached, a little abstract, a little bit too heavenly minded to be too much earthly good, so to speak. And so sensation comes in, and now it's an embodied vision with a Eucharist and bread and blood, and all those dimensions of it start to pour in. And this is sort of the renewal. Now, I wanted to pause for just a minute. I'm watching the clock, and just suggest that this is an archetypal story, and in that sense, the whole notion of a death and renewal is not unique to Christianity by any stretch. If we look back over the landscape in the ancient world, we can find these archetypes floating around in different forms all over the place. In the Hebrew, obviously, Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, is probably the most articulate expression of the redemptive nature of suffering as a social and a historical dimension to it. In the Hellenistic world, there are the dying and rising gods, and going all the way back to Osiris and Isis and Horus in ancient Egypt. There's this notion in the ancient Near East that the kings were somehow tied in their, what's the word? Their virility, their strength, their productivity, with the land itself. And as the king went, so went the land. And there is a ritual that is very common that scholars know about, where the king in the ancient world, when his time was up, so to speak, was slain and pretty much maltreated, shall I say, before he's slain, and buried. And the notion is that they're taking that energy and putting it back into the land so the land will be fruitful. And that might sound, well, that's pagan. Yeah, it is. But think of the Arthur legend. That this survives even into the Christian era through a story like Arthur, who was himself tied to the land. And as Arthur went, so went the land of England. And when Arthur fell ill and had the soul wound, so to speak, the land became barren. So this is a common notion. There are a couple of things now that I'd like to move into, because I think I only have a few more minutes to kind of summarize this. I'd like to present it now more in a Jungian or sort of therapeutic way. We talked about the coming, kind of Latin alchemical term. That means the opposites come together and somehow in their clashing and they mingle and something new comes out of their interaction. And this is the way it is in the psyche as well. And this is that moment when the ego is dismembered, if you will, and something new is reconstituted in its place. So a new myth emerges. And I'd like to say that in the gospel story, it seems to me a new myth emerges, a new God image emerges, a new sense of who God the Father is and what it is to connect with the divine emerges. It's a dark story in many ways. I think Mark's version is particularly dark. It's a story of a death in a way. Maybe it's a story of an archetypal divorce, where God and the temple seem to be parting ways on some level. At least that would be a Christian reading of it, a classical Christian reading of it. And that somehow the God image that existed at that time itself had to descend into a dark place in order to be renewed. And the Christian story is on some level an attempt to renew the image of God and to differentiate God's light and dark side, so to speak, which I think Jesus does. Is it a final word? No, it is not a final word, because that light and dark, even though we can differentiate them and maybe after we've gone through our crisis, we can better define them, but they will always pull toward one another and always be mixing and renewing, separating, mixing, renewing, separating, because that's the way consciousness evolves. And that's what this story tells us. It is not a final word. It is an ongoing process. The final chapter in my book is called Christianity's Long Shadow. I don't have time to go into it today. But it sort of seems to me that this story points us in that direction, that we can look over 2,000 years of history and we can see this sort of struggle and this movement forward of the psyche. And it just wonders, it makes me wonder where we are today and where we're going tomorrow. What's going to happen to the Christian story? How is it being transformed? And how are we being transformed as we go through this time in Christian history where things are so much up in the air, shall we say? What I try to offer in this series is a creative or imaginative reading of the story in terms of our own individual and collective development. We come back to this notion of the tetramorph Christ, surrounded by the four beasts of Revelation, also the four Gospels. You'll recall the portal of entry into the other world. We talked about that. So here now is the archetype of wholeness. What if Christianity were to focus on wholeness rather than perfection? What if Christianity were to somehow find a place of value for those aspects that we now consider dark? Even the body itself, nature itself, the feminine. What if these, and those are the three that Jung picked on, perhaps even the demonic. What if we found a value in those and found a way to integrate them into the vision of what Christianity is? How would that transform it? For Jung, the cross and the circle together were some sort of ultimate archetypal symbol. And he really explored and played with this quite a bit. I wanted to superimpose a Tibetan Buddhist mandala over this, but I ran out of them, so I couldn't do it. So you'll have to just imagine a mandala. You know what a mandala is, a circular drawing in Buddhism, and other Native Americans have them. These beautiful drawings that really are a way of organizing our experience, our story. How do you organize your story? What are the dark elements of your story? What are those parts of your story that have been pushed away, that have been pushed down into a back corner? Can we find a way to put them in the mandala, to have a place for them and recognize their value, as dark and as uncomfortable as they may be, in the whole and in the unfolding of the story? Jung seemed to think that there was room for all of it. And so I also come back now in conclusion to Joseph Campbell, a couple quotes from him which I love, which I think kind of summarize for us, or at least for me, what I've been trying to convey. If we, this is actually a graph graphic from a previous lecture I did. But I don't think you can read the bottom, but I can, so here we go. Joseph Campbell says, in our temporal living, we are bound to either one or the other function in each pair. Thus, we are living as partial human beings. To be released from this limitation, one must, in some sense, die to the laws of virtue and sin under which one lives, opening oneself to a circulation of light and energy from all four functions, while remaining centered in the middle, like the tree of life in the garden, where the rivers flow in four directions, or like the point of intersection between the two beams of the cross. You see the world's radiant joy, and you say yes to it all, and you do not say no to it at all. And then finally, Mr. Campbell, I couldn't resist this one. We are all heroes in our own story, and we are collectively on our own, on a collective hero's journey toward what? The future we make, the future we can imagine. We have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path, and where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world. And I think I'm going to stop on that note right there and open this for final reflections, questions. Anybody? Any questions? Pastor Dan starts. Yeah, go ahead.
Your book, is that available for us to read?
You know, I've wrestled with that. I gave you readings, sort of the highlights, but the book is sort of a draft at this point. I think it's like 95% presentable to my standards. I could make it available to you. I'm still in the process of editing. I think it reads okay, but it's not, you know, spit shine yet. But if you really are interested and you'd like a copy, I can run one for you. So let me know, and I'll make a list, and I think it costs me $20 to run it at Kinko's. So if you want to cover that, it's great. Yeah.
I got a question about this story in fear. So the disciples are always afraid of something. So Jesus, people are always afraid of this and that. So where does that fit in the story?
Fear. He was wondering where fear fits into the story. That's a good question. To read that from a psychological or Jungian point of view, at those key moments in the drama where the men run off. I mean, I don't want to say where it fits in, but my immediate response to it would be, well, gee, we are afraid to really descend into our own unconscious. We're afraid that, there's that alien part of us. It becomes so alienated, and we can only see it as other. So what we tend to do is project it onto the other, and usually that's a negative projection, not always. It can be very, we can idealize or we can demonize. When you find yourself idealizing or demonizing, you have to ask yourself, what part of me am I not owning here? Am I afraid of? That's so afraid of that I can't accept it for myself, I have to put it onto somebody else so that they'll carry it for me and reflect it back to me. So I think it is our fear of the unknown, it is our fear of the uncomfortable, which in Jung's words would be, or in his theory would be the unconscious.
Because you can't get the wholeness if you don't tackle fear.
Right.
Notice it.
If you don't tackle fear,
Well, if you either acknowledge it or you have to do something with the fear.
the hero's journey takes courage. It takes courage. That's all there is to it. And yeah. Anybody else? What's that?
I do have a question, but I can't see behind
Oh,
me.
you can't. No, I'm looking. Well, we'll put you down in the queue.
Would you?
Okay. Yeah, there's some.
There's someone, yeah.
Somebody, I think
know,
I knew once.
So I was just to make it clearer over here,
Yeah.
the projection that Dorothy does in the Wizard of Oz.
Yes. Well, we talked quite a bit about that when I did the shadow
Oh,
thing.
okay.
But projection is this notion that what we can't own of our own potential or our own, some part of our own psyche that we've somehow identified as unacceptable, undesirable. Usually that's a social thing, you know. I'm creative, but, you know, my dad wants me to be a lawyer. So, you know, the creative side goes down. Now, it could come back up in what they call a return of the repressed and flip me into the total opposite, where I go off in rebellion and just, you know, become a bum on this, you know, an art bum. I don't know, you know, somebody who's so given over to that now that it becomes a destructive thing. There's, you know, this is the whole point, is that it's about a dialogue. It's never about being, you don't want to be overtaken by the unconscious. That can be destructive. But by the same token, you don't want to completely ignore the unconscious. You have to find a way to dialogue, to listen, and to negotiate, really, to navigate that into finally integrating it. If you don't pay attention to your, I just pulled out creativity. If you don't pay attention to your creative side, you know, your intuitive side, it's going to get you. It's going to come back and knock on your door, and it's going to come back harder and harder and harder. And the events that it precipitates in order to get into your consciousness will become more and more severe. Remember what you have said about God. God is that which crosses my path violently at times and recklessly, changing my conscious plans and intentions, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And the point is, you know, it'll get your attention. So the goal would be to facilitate conversation. Yes, sir.
I guess it's just a little bit of a reflection on your statement about where's Christianity going.
Yes.
And I spent a lot of my last years anyway focused in on the life and teachings of Jesus, you know, and the historical scholars tend to spend a lot of energy on that, right?
Right.
But hearing you talk, that's just like one phase of the whole puzzle. And this, in a sense, I can see now how that dismisses this need to kind of delve into that shadow side or the sensate side that is really where it all goes dark so that something new can happen.
Right.
And it feels like we've got all this information we gathered, but we got to take it into the great. There's got to be some journey that's taken with this that makes me extremely nervous.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do. You're just scaring the crap out of me. But I think that's important for the church to realize it's got to go that far with this, or it won't go. It won't go.
It won't go.
Does that make sense?
It totally, 1,000% makes sense. I mean, listen, I'm all for scholarship because I do a lot of that. But I also recognize that there are agendas in scholarship. And I think this sort of, I won't, you know, I don't have time to, we could have a great breakfast conversation about this, but this tendency to sort of humanize and almost make him a mundane, just extraordinary, you know, teacher and wise. It's sort of like we want to just cut the shadow off.
That's what I'm
And
implying.
we like this.
Yeah.
Can we have this? We don't want that. You know, but that's part of the story. That's what makes it psychologically, archetypally authentic.
Right.
And if you cut that out, you've truncated the story.
And you've dismissed your own ability to evolve.
Absolutely. You fail to challenge yourself to be a follower of Christ, to take up the cross.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Ouch.
Yeah.
I know. You know, let me just, anything else, because we're going to close right now. It's 10:30 on the dot.
Oh, that's not bad.
Okay, so what we're done, right?
We are done unless there's one more. Well,
Okay.
why don't we say we're done?
Yeah,
Because they
we'll
could ask you probably.
Let me just, pardon?
One minute, thank you. So-
All right, 1 minute. I'll let you have that right now.
All right. Well, I know Randy put a lot of work into this because this is a huge amount of data. And we just got a lecture from someone who didn't do this hard lifting of kind of fine-tuning the data so that we could kind of wrap our heads around it. So I just want to thank you for all the energy you put taking all this work you've done and try to get it into 4 little sections for us.
Thank you.
It required a lot of beautiful energy. So a big one. My last comment would be, I don't think Randy and Christie are going anywhere anytime soon, so I'm hoping that once Randy recovers from this class and getting ready for you, that we can talk to him again about just other ways to, this doesn't have to dominate our landscape, but I think it's important to keep in front of ourselves periodically, lest we get too far afield in just one channel. How do you keep all those four pieces kind of floating around in our community life collectively so that we're connected in that way? And you're just an important voice, I think, that we need to pay attention to as we move forward. So we'll give you a little bit of break, but then we'll get to stitch you back in again. Okay, thank you all for participating in this one. We get 2 weeks break now.